So the standards are very strict, but I'm looking at whether the standards are very strict, but the outcomes are very pathetic. So I don't know if you heard the Chief Minister of Delhi compared Delhi to a gas chamber. So it's not as bad as a real gas chamber, but it is incredibly polluted. So Delhi is one of the most polluted, probably the most polluted city in the world, or the second one, etc. We often talk about pollution in China, but China is like literally a pure mountain air compared to the most polluted city in India. It's extraordinarily polluted. Gujarat, so basically it has this very strict standard, but they are not respected. So of course the pollution in Delhi is not just industrial pollution. It comes in part from burning of crops outside of Delhi, which has an interesting political economy problem. It comes from cars, and it comes from the fact that Delhi is unlucky because it's in a basin basically, and it suffers from a phenomenon called thermal inversion in the winter, which is that the polluted air is trapped by warm. There is cold air down, and the polluted air is trapped by hot air, so it can't go anywhere. So the air stays there. Is a very little flow. So industrial pollution is not only to blame, but in part industrial pollution is to blame, and the enforcement, despite those standards and those super strict penalties, the enforcement is very, very low, absolutely pathetic. Yeah.
Yes, even if we have a very strict regulatory framework, do we have any evidence of any information about corruption cases in India?
Yeah, so corruption is an issue, and then information is an issue. So I'm going to mostly not talk much about corruption today, although I'm agreeing. Well, I guess I am going to talk about corruption in a way. So I'm not going to talk that much about corruption of officials, but I'm going to talk about corruption of third-party auditors. So yes, so enforcement is a problem because there is corruption, probably because information is very bad. So this is Gujarat. Gujarat is where the current chief minister hails from. It has had very, very high annual output growth. It's really one of the very fast-growing place. It has post-licensing reform that we just studied is where the growth was faster, industrial investment. It's well known to be industry-friendly. It is very polluted in particular. It has the most critically polluted industrial cluster in the country, 8 of them, including the 2 most polluted in the country. So Vapi has the distinction of being one of the 10 most polluted places on Earth, with, for example, groundwater mercury 96 times higher than WHO standard. So this is Surat, where you can see the stacks. In three of India's 5 most polluted rivers are there, and all the major cities are in violation of national standard. How are you to regulate? First of all, if you want to punish the firm for pollution, you need to have information on the firm. And there are really 2 ways in which this is being done in Gujarat. One is the third-party audit, and the other is inspection. So inspection is the standard bread and butter way. Basically, you have a Gujarat Pollution Control Board. They have teams of inspectors. They send them to the farm. They collect samples. They bring these samples back. And if the farm is terribly polluted, then someone else is going back and checking. And then some bargaining ensues with the farm, corruption, exchanges, things are being done. And eventually, maybe the farm installs some pollution equipment or runs the pollution abatement equipment that they do have. So the 2 questions, and then what happened in Gujarat is that the Gujarat is so polluted that there was a court case brought by a civil society against the government for not enforcing their own regulation. And what the Supreme Court of Gujarat did in response is to say, well, since you are incapable of doing it yourself, you need to put in place a system of third-party auditing where each farms at high pollution potential is going to have to hire an auditor and pay them from the private sector, pay them themselves. This is a polluter pay principle, and get a pollution audit every year. So that's the idea of private sector involvement substituting for low state capacity. So that's not a unique thing. It's kind of third-party auditing is used a lot. Of course, in financial regulation, you have heard about the auditing of firms is done by private firms. In the environment, they are used increasingly often. There's potential advantage that they have more capacity, they have more expertise, they are more flexible, etc. And you can also grow them fast. They are really essential in the world of carbon offsets. So when you buy carbon credit, someone needs to audit that when you take a flight, you can opt to pay a bit more to offset your thing. So you're giving money to the airline company. The airline company is in turn needs to give this money to someone who, because of this money, reduces their carbon emissions. Someone needs to audit that. So there is a whole private market out there of people who audit that. Just to say that it's pretty important in environment. But the problem with third party, of course, is that they have huge conflict of interest. So it's the firm that is hiring the auditor and can fire them. So of course the incentive of the auditor is to provide information that the firm wants to hear. And in particular to provide information like if a clean sheet of clean bill of health. So of course there are many cases in the world where audits have been unreliable. You talked about in an Enron scandal which led to the breakup of some of the major auditing firms. And then again in the 2008 crisis with the rating, credit rating, etc., where came into this area with this very basic idea that there is this conflict of interest. So what we did is that so here is how interesting backstory of how we got into contact with the Gujarat Pollution Control Board. The firms sued the government to say, look, you're not using these measures, which are all junk anyway, but still we have to pay for it. So basically that's a tax that you're imposing on us, and that's not fair. So that was a bit, they had some chutzpah to argue on this basis. They lost the case. But in the process, we got contacted by the lawyer of GPCB, who wanted to see whether it was possible to make some suggestion on how to make the scheme more effective as a way of countering, first it would be nice to have it more effective, but plus countering this claim that the scheme was ineffective. So what we proposed is to remove the conflict of interest on a pilot basis. So in the status quo, only the firms that at high pollution potential, like dyes and that kind of things, are chemical, are subject to the regulation. Then they need to pick an auditor, and the auditor visits 3 times and submits a report. So what we proposed is to break the conflict of interest by doing 3 things. And the first one is the most important one, is to say, well, instead of choosing the auditor, the firm is going to pay into a central pool, and the central pool is going to hire the auditor, and it's going to be done randomly, and then every year we randomize. So the auditor doesn't have any loyalty to the firm. Instead, it has loyalty to the pool. And what the pool is requesting is accuracy. So we back-check the firms for accuracy. We did this for 2 years. In the first year, the incentive to provide accuracy was that you would be kicked out otherwise, and the pool paid more than the firm, for reasons that are going to be obvious in a minute. And in year 2 experiment, we paid them a bonus to be accurate because we didn't know if the scheme was going to continue, so we couldn't promise them to stay. So this is the type of stuff that they do. They go and collect water and air from the stacks. And this is what the audit reading. So we obtain data from the auditors in the treatment and the control group. This is what we have from the control group, where you can see that these Indian firms are really, really effective at being right on the margin of allowable pollution. So this is very nice optimization by the firms. So 73% of the mass is between the threshold and 10% of the threshold. But then what we did to evaluate this intervention is that we sent back checkers so to the firms, not checking all of them, but we have a bunch of them. And so they go immediately after, usually within a week or 2 weeks. And this is what we found in the back check. That's a distribution of pollution for the same firm in the back check. So that was kind of a bit of a bummer for the quality of these audits. And the interesting part is that, of course, there are many firms that pollute more than the threshold, which the auditor nicely put back instead. But you even have firms here that are very low pollution that you don't see in the audit. So why is that? Why would you cheat on, why would you misreport low pollution? Yeah?
If you don't want to have average number lower than other auditing firms, you will just put the lower.
Both, yeah, so, but the average is still lower, so that could be one reason. What could be another reason? Yeah.
If you don't check anyway, you just want them to be below the threshold?
Yeah, exactly. If you're going to make up the data anyway, like why bother going? So, you know, no point doctoring the data after the fact. You might as well just make up the data. It has the advantage of being substantially cheaper. And in fact, the price that you would have to pay for paying your audit was much cheaper than the minimum cost that it would take to actually test the samples. So that's why we paid higher prices. The pool paid higher prices than the firms, because the actual cost of the activity was higher. Anyway, that was the control. And this was the treatment in the midline as the auditor and the back check. So you can see that comparing the control to the, compare this graph to this graph, and the treatment really reduced the excess mass. So this is just for one pollutant, where the excess mass goes down from 73% to 39% compared to a real mass of about 15%. So this is just this one pollutant by pollutant, it went to about 85% accuracy. So that was, that's kind of applying very simple economics. In fact, the recommendation that we gave them were pretty much translation of recommendations that were made by a former chairman of the Security of Exchange Commission after the 2008 crisis. But no one took him up in the American financial market. It was not in Dodd-Frank, and to the extent nothing's left of Dodd-Frank anyway, it doesn't matter. But in this case, we could try it out, and it worked. And the nice thing is that we had done it, or they had done it, our government partner had done it, such that it was not like a change in it was all consistent with the Supreme Court order as written. So there was no need to go back and redo. It was just a different way of, precising, making the rules more precise. And therefore, once they saw that it worked, it was fairly easy to get it basically adopted as the way that they are doing third-party auditing in Gujarat. So subsequent to that, it took about a year after that, and now this is the rule. So this is nice. In particular, it's nice. So this is the density of pollutant right across the threshold went down a lot. This is just a difference between the two, between this graph and that graph. But for all of the pollutants, normalized around the threshold, you can see that you have a huge dip in the fraction of firms that are shown just below the threshold, which is compensated by an increase both to the left and, of course, more to the right, because there are more firms to the right. And the reason why we were happy that it was enforced is that seemed to have this better enforcement on the firms, seemed to have an effect on the pollution, in particular for water, not so much for air, where you have a reduction in average pollution, which is driven almost exclusively by very top end pollution, which is probably good from a social point of view, that you want to avoid very top-end pollution, and which is consistent with the fact that the regulator tends to treat the standard as a suggestion, not as something that they are forced to enforce. So these are the various punishments that you can get as a function of how polluted you are. So the worst, of course, is to have your utility disconnected. So if they can't, if they're fed up dealing with you, they're going to shut your water and your electricity, so you can't do anything. And you can see that utility disconnection is very rare for firms that are between 1 and 1.5 times the standard, which might seem to be a lot in a civilized country. But when you have lots of firms that have 10 times the standard, it's not that much. And it's really the firms that are 10 times the standard that the regulator goes after very aggressively. So going back to your question, corruption, there is surely corruption with the regulator. In that case, there was a lot of corruption with the private market, and even with the leftover corruption in the regulator, there is still much more punishment for the high polluters, which has led to a reduction in pollution from the high polluter once you have a better communication stream. So that's the inspection paper. Yeah.
Coming back to the problem results about pollution of air, how do you measure pollution of air? Do you have enough heterogeneity to look at that?
Oh yeah, the pollution of air is coming from, it's like emission at the stack level. We have a photo here. This is stack sampling.
Okay.
So this is not the air like all around. So for basically they sample, so they sample water coming out of which gets out of the farm. You know, this is like the water that goes to the river. They sample the water and then they test for all sorts of pollutants in it. And then they sample the air and then they test for all sorts of pollutants in it. So when I say water pollution, air pollution is basically a standardized index of about 6 or 7 water pollutants and 6 or 7 air pollutants, right from the farm. Any other question on inspection, on auditing? So then I'll talk about inspections now. So inspection is kind of what pollution control boards do. In fact, in a lot of states, that third-party audit system is not there at all. In Gujarat, it was imposed by the courts, but it's not necessarily there. They have routine inspection. So in principle, each firm needs to be, as a function of their size and their pollution and what they produce, which gives their pollution potential, there is a minimum number of times that a firm needs to be inspected in a year. So a small firm in a not very polluting sector, that's called green. There is green, yellow, and red category. So a small green needs to be inspected once a year, a large red 4 times a year. So each firm has minimum inspection rates. So that's the routine inspection that they are doing. It's at the complete discretion of the head of that office in each city, conditional on principle in this restriction. And then you have licensing. So whenever a firm wants to do something new, they need to get a new license. So you have to go for that. And follow up. So this is a combination of, maybe you found a lot of pollution here, you have to come back again. And complaints. If they get a complaint from anyone, they could go. So based on the inspection result, the officer decides to act. So you might cite the plan for violation, request an explanation, threaten the plan with closure, mandate installation of equipment, require posting of a ban, close their utilities, that kind of stuff by level of. The problem with inspection is that there is never enough people to inspect all of the firms at the prescribed rate. So even though in principle there is these rules of how often you're supposed to inspect everyone, in reality you have a lot of discretion because you could not physically go everywhere, so you have a lot of discretion. And therefore, that can create arbitrariness. So there is certainly a perception that there is a lot of arbitrariness in where they are going, and oppression of farms, and bribes and rent-seeking. So this whole corruption that you were talking about really comes up as the. So in fact, for labor inspection, Modi removed all the discretion and moved to a random schedule of inspections. So now it's a computer that says where you're supposed to go every day. So what's the trade-off between that? The trade-off is that the computer has absolutely no idea, no signal of where a violation might have taken place. So if you're going to a random place, if you force the inspectors to go inspect a random farm, you are throwing out all the information that they have. But on the other hand, if they are misusing if they're not going to the most polluted place, but they're going to the place where they're going to get the most bribe, then, I mean, by the way, it could be that the place where they're going to get the most bribe is the most polluted place. So, but if they are doing something different, they're going to the people they don't like or whatnot, then you, by forcing them to go to random places, you're throwing out this information. So that's basically the tension that is being faced that Modi completely ignored by going to fully random inspection. And even though I do like things to be randomized, the question here is how much would we lose by going to, how much would we, so basically in a sense is how much would we gain by doing what it suggests, which is going to the prescribed level of inspection, but doing it randomly, like the law suggests. So on the one hand, you'd have more resources, and on the other hand, those resources would be spread without using the information you do have. So what we did is so just evidence that they are not farms are not inspected at the prescribed rate. So this would be the number of days since the last inspection that you expect. For large, medium, and small firms, it should be 90 days, but it's usually it's double of it. And for the small firm, it should be a year, but for the most part, they have not been inspected for 2 years. So what we did is that we tried for a random set of firms, move to the jury system by giving enough resources to have the right rate of inspection every 90 days, for example, for polluting farms, or every year for small farms, and at the same time, to remove the initial discretion in the assignment of those inspections, just for the initial inspection. Of course, the follow-up depends on what is being found, so we didn't touch that. But so basically, we provided resources for the initial inspection, and with the view that these resources needed to be used, and we used the software to tell them where to go to do this extra inspection. So we basically did a mock-up of what the policy of no discretion but enough resources to go anywhere would be. And we look at the impact of that, and then we try to unpack the effect of more resources and the effect of less discretion, given that we just have one experiment that does both at the same time. So the ideal experiment would have been to increase resources, but just give them the money, the extra manpower, and leave them do whatever they wanted to do. Or, with the same money, ask them to randomize. So the latter was not possible. They were not interested in cooperating unless there was some extra resources on the table. And the former was not possible because it is super expensive and we didn't have so much money. So we could only do one treatment, basically. It was already like millions of dollars, and so we just couldn't, because these things are expensive. Everything is expensive, much more expensive than what I typically do. But the inspection team is expensive, data collection is expensive, etc. So we worked with 900 plants. They were part of the same audit experiment, so we stratified by that. So 490 are not eligible for audit in the population, so somewhat less polluting. And then half of them were assigned to this treatment where they were inspected more often, and that lasted for 2 years. So what we need to hire we need to have additional inspection. The GPCB could not hire full new staff because it was only project money, so they couldn't hire new civil servants. But what they found is they found recently retired staff in each region and got them on contract. So we have these teams of guys, and they basically got mixed up with the rest of the people because we didn't want our own inspection teams, JPAL inspection teams, and then they went and did the inspection. The way that the inspection are logged in the system is that once a team comes back with an inspection, they report what they found, and it goes into a big software that the head of the office has access to and can look where they want to go back, what action they want to follow up. So one thing that was important to us is that those extra inspections that were mandated under the treatment would not be flagged. So they are enter into the system like any other inspection. So just think about this experiment as just modifying the initial targeting from whatever they would have gone naturally to this random inspection, but more frequent. And we have data from, and we have administrative data, very, very rich, because all of this interaction between the firm and the officers is logged in. Maybe not the under-the-table interactions, but all of exchange of letters, like we found you polluted like that. Oh, sorry, this day our thing was not working, but now it's working, so then you come back again. All of this is logged in. So we have all of this information. And then we did an end-line survey to look at the effect. So in terms of what it did, it seems that it was effective at increasing number of inspection. That's encouraging. Otherwise, there would be very little to talk about now. But in particular, it moved basically. It didn't increase and that's something that I'm going to return to. That's very important. It didn't change the right tail. Some firms are really inspected a lot, and that's true in control and in treatment. It changed the lower tail, so you have almost no firms got inspected 0 times. So the annual average difference is 1.71. The firms do realize that they are inspected more often, not to a full extent, but that's important because that this is what is going to affect their behavior, that they now realize that they are inspected more often. So now this is what happened in terms of, after that, what happened, so they got inspected more often. So obviously, since they're always in violation, they got cited more often. They got more warnings that they would be closed. But then, if you look down the line, you actually don't see more actual punishment. So they got cited more, they got warned more, but there is no change in closure direction. They're asking for bank guarantee, mandates, etc. So there was no bite to this to the treatment, even though they were in fact inspected more. So why is it the case? So then, as a result, what did firms do? Very little. So they didn't do anything expensive. They didn't install new equipment. They did cheaper stuff, which is they run the existing equipment more. So unfortunately, we don't have how much they are spending on electricity, etc., to run their effluent treatment plant or to run their boiler stack cleaner, scrubbers. But what we know is how much money they spend on maintaining them. And the more you use them, the more you need to maintain them. And we find that they were more likely to spend money on routine maintenance of their existing equipment. So they seem to have used their existing equipment a little more. And what did it do as a result? Well, there was a small, so this is at the end line, the change in pollution in treatment versus control. And what you see is that, contrary to the audit experiment, nothing at the right tail. So there was no change in the behavior of very polluting firms, but a small change over here in the probability that you are going from not compliant to just compliant. which is consistent with not installing any new machine, but running the ones you have a little more. So this is kind of a little bit disappointing because it costs a lot of money to do. If they wanted to do it full scale, it would cost a huge amount of budget, and it didn't produce much. So this is summarizing the effect. The inspection treatment had no effect on pollution, whereas the audit treatment did. And it had a small effect on compliance, where firms, so 4% of being just compliant. So firms are inspected more, but they're not punished more. And it's not because the firms are suddenly become great. They don't seem to spend so much more money, and there is very little effect on pollution, in contrast to the audit result. Little bit, but not huge. So what could be going on? Well, one possibility is that the regulator gets the information and does nothing with it. That doesn't seem to be true, because we do see that in general they do use costly punishment, and of course we had an effect of the audit treatment. The other possibility is that they treated those as JPAL inspection. They weren't interested in them. But this doesn't seem to be possible because the additional inspection were entered into the system, and they can't be differentiated from the control inspection, so there are no reason for them to be treated differently. And in fact, we do show that the regulatory interaction post the first inspection is exactly the same in treatment and control, conditional on how polluted the firm is. The other possibility is that the information collected in the inspection was different, and that's what we are going to look at now. And why was it different? Well, it was different because the set of firms that were inspected were different. So in general, in the status quo, the firms that are very polluting, so this goes from 1 to 4 depending on how polluted you are. We looked at your real pollution at end line, and then we got data for what happened after, in the future, after the experiment. And we can see that the number of inspections for highly polluted farm is higher. So in general, the regulators seem to be looking for the highly polluting farms. You can see that the increase is monotonic till these bins. So they seem to have some information of where they should be going. And they don't visit randomly, they visit the highly polluting farms. But in the experiment, of course, we asked them to randomize. So the targeting became less efficient by construction. So you can see that there was no difference in the probability of being inspected for the highly polluting farm, +5 and 5 times standard and 10 times standard. And the increase mostly came from these not so polluting farms. So basically, it's like, think of catching fish. The experiment put the net in the water and got anything that came out. Small fish, large fish, everything. Whereas the regulator is going at it more purposefully, and is kind of looking for big fish, and is more likely to find big fish. So they find many less small fish, but the same amount of big fish. So then this could be an interpretation. This could be a reason why. The treatment has no effect, is because the treatment is not increasing the number of large farms because they are going towards them anyway. And if it's not increasing the chance for very highly polluting farms to be inspected, then it doesn't change their incentive to pollute less. So what we do then is that we combine, so we collect a lot of data on this behavior of the firm and the regulator with the goal of computing the cost of a particular firm to have an inspector showing at their doorstep. And the cost depends on once you have an inspector showing up at your doorstep, as a function of how polluting you are. If you're not polluting, it's very cheap. If you're very polluting, we know and that's what we estimate from looking at the chain of back and forth, which ends up with a final punishment. We estimate the cost that you will have to pay, either by finally installing some abatement capital or paying a fine. And what you find, I'm not going to get into the detail of that estimation, but what you find as a result of that estimation is that it's more costly to be inspected for a very polluting farm than for a less polluting farm. And therefore, how well are going to farm behaving in anticipation of expectation? So waiting for so there is a targeting stage where the farm and the plant are moving at the same time. The regulator, what are they trying to do? They seek to minimize pollution, so they want to maximize abatement by the farms under a budget constraint of an inspection. They only have so many inspections to give, so that's what they're trying to do. So based on the information they have, they are going to try and target their inspection as well as possible. Note that here we are completely assuming no corruption, but in a sense, we would see the corruption by reflection, which is if we find that they are targeting very, very badly, it might be because they are corrupting. Then the plant knows the targeting rule, and they decide whether or not to take preventive abatement action to reduce the probability of being inspected or to reduce the cost once you're inspected. So think of, for example, putting a radar on a highway. You are, as the policeman, you're going to try and place the radar both where it's most dangerous and where you might catch the most people. And as a car, knowing that the radar is in place, you're going to slow down when you anticipate that there will be a radar. So here, it's the same thing again, is the effect on pollution is not so much from the direct effect of forcing people to put a machine once they, or cutting them down once they are found to be polluted. The main effect is coming from the effect on all the people who are changing their behavior, anticipating that they might otherwise be inspected and harassed. So in fact, there is probably a direct effect of the inspection on the pollution because some farms are shut down if they are really bad. We are going to completely ignore that and think about just that the effect, the deterrence effect from the risk that you might be inspected. So if the regulator is good at targeting the farms that would otherwise be very polluted, that's going to give them an incentive to run their pollution abatement equipment more to avoid being targeted. Okay? So that's the targeting stage. That's the one we are most interested in. And in that, for that, we need to know what's the cost of being inspected. And so we have a penalty stage, which is someone shows up at your door stage. After that, we observe this complicated dance between the agency and the farm. And basically, we have a matrix of given your behavior, given the behavior of they play one after the other. Given the behavior of the farm, what is the transition probability for the guy? So what the inspector can do is first inspect, warn, punish, or accept. So first they inspect and they get an inspection report. Then after an inspection report, they can warn them with those three things. Then they can punish, or they can just close the file and move on. And the action can ignore, protest, or comply. And what we did is we coded all of the letters we saw from the regulator and from the farm to code these actions. And what you get is a sort of a transaction matrix of what people do at various stages. So the regulator inspects, and then the first thing, they move first. So in 85% of the case, they just let things go. They accept, and there is no further. Then sometimes they inspect again, or they warn, or they punish. And the plant, when there is any of these three, they can decide to ignore, or they protest, or they comply. And then it moves again, and you can see that over time there is more punishment in the later rounds. There is more punishment. So you can estimate as a function of. So you take the behavior of the regulator as a machine. Gives you the transition space between if I do this, this is what they'll do. You can estimate the farm's cost by showing that at the end of the day they prefer to install abatement, which we see the action. We see the cost of that for some farms, so we know the cost of abatement. If they do something else in between, like complying or whatnot, we can see that there must have been a difference between the two actions, and that allows you to estimate the value of the farm of each step and then integrate it back up to know the value of the farm of, given your pollution, someone showing up. So we do that. That's the cost of regulation as a function of your pollution. And you can see that the cost of regulation as a function of your pollution, not surprisingly, increases with your level of pollution. Both because you need to abate and because there are penalties. So you can separate the cost between the direct cost of installing a machine if you have to, or the cost of penalty. Now we have the targeting stage. So what this complicated set of equations say is very simple. Is to say that the regulator will choose where to inspect. This is the targeting rule, in order to maximize the probability that each inspection is introducing more abatement. So this is the pollution without abatement. With abatement, this is a pollution without abatement. So the farms can decide or not to run their equipment. And the regulator is saying, looking at all the farms and saying, given what I know about this farm, this is what they observe, the pollution that they observe, given the signal that I have about this farm, if I go to them, or if I go to more farms that have this type of signal, is it going to discourage them more? So, for example, they could decide that they will go to farms that tend to be very polluting, because these are the farms that they want to induce abatement from, both because it reduces the pollution more, and because the cost of inspection for this farm is very high, so they would prefer to stay out of that. So basically, the regulator observes some signal, makes a decision of how to allocate their inspection, conditional on respecting their budget constraint. So that's what the behavior the regulator is trying to do, and they are given that they know that the farm is going to run the farm to run their equipment if the value of running it is larger than the cost of running it. So that gives you a system of equation where pollution is going to be reduced by running the equipment by a proportional factor. So phi 2 is going to be negative. And what the regulator is really trying to do is to induce more people to switch to running the equipment. And they are going to do that basically by threatening inspection. So farms know that given their pollution, they are likely to be inspected more. A key distinction is part of the pollution is seen by the regulator, and part of the pollution is not seen by the regulator. So the regulator's information is very imperfect. So if the regulator had perfect information, they could really target the absolute most polluting farm. Anticipating that, the absolute most polluting farm would try to become less polluting. But if your signal is very imperfect, you're going towards your signal and you're going to get it wrong some of the time. So then we estimate this thing. And what we find is that the inspection treatment, of course, increases the level of inspection, but it reduces the targeting a lot, which is not surprising. It's because the inspection treatment makes you go to random, and random is less well targeted than usually. We also find that running equipment reduces pollution by 85%. Which is very compatible with engineering estimate. So the farms, many of the farms have the equipment, but they don't even run it. They don't even run it because they're inspected very infrequently and it's not worth it. But if they did, that would reduce pollution by 85%. We also find that the regulator observes only 19% of the pollution. So their information is very poor, and despite that, they very strongly target by what they know. A farm that has one standard deviation more inspected observed pollution get 1.64 more inspections per year. So despite having very poor information, they still target very heavily towards the farms that have poor where they think they have this bad signal of pollution. And the reason is that you have no reason to catch the not very polluting farms, because the cost of inspection for a not very polluting farm is very low. So the not very polluting farm have no incentive to run their equipment anyway, because it's fine. It makes no difference to them. If they are inspected, the cost is not going to be huge. So they are just, it's very hard to induce them to run the equipment. But if you remove it, because 85% of a small deviation is not much, but 85% of a large deviation is enormous. So the very highly polluting farm have a huge incentive to run their equipment if they think that they are going to be targeted. And therefore, even though your information is poor, it is worthwhile to put the whole packet towards them. So that sort of rationalizes why we see very little inspection of the not so polluting farm. The only ones that are picked up are the ones that the regulator thought was polluting but are not in fact polluting. And then a lot of inspection of the highly polluting farm. And the only reason why they are not all inspected is that the regulator misses a lot of them. So then you can estimate treatment effects as predicted by the model, as predicted by the data. They sort of look similar. In particular, we have that gain of the additional random inspection in the model coming from the fact that you are now catching more of the not very polluting farm, and therefore it becomes more valuable for the not polluting farm to run the equipment. This is the most interesting graph, so I'm going to show it and stop there, which tells us, which basically are counterfactuals. So what we do is we estimate we assume a different world, and then for this different world, we recompute the optimal rule for the regulator, and then how much pollution you would have in different, how much abatement you would have by targeting regime. So what you have here on the left is reduction in pollution, so higher is better. So what we did in our experiment is this. We went from this to this, which we went to the partial information, like the real information they have in the system, where they observe 19% of the true variation in pollution. That's what's happening in the status quo. And then we changed the number of inspection from 1.5 to 3, but we did that with random allocation. So we moved on this lower dotted line here, and we ended up here. And that's why the effect is not really big compared to what we have here. If instead we had given them the flexibility in allocating this extra inspection the way that they want to do, the way that they normally do it, we would have been here. If instead we would have forced them to do everything randomly, this is what we would have had. So for example, at a low level of inspection, doing them randomly would be a disaster. Then it sort of converged a little bit. Of course, if you have enough inspection, eventually you will inspect everybody often enough that it will be sufficient to get good incentives. So that's the blue line, showing sort of the loss the loss in transmission, so to speak, the loss in not allowing them to use the information they have. And that one is how much pollution abatement they could have with the same inspection budget if they had perfect information. If instead of U1 being only 19% of the total variation in pollution, they were somehow able to do 100%. And you can see that there is a huge gain. That the gain, for example, they could stay at the same number of inspection with better signal on pollution, then and get a much larger effect than what we did, which is doubling the inspection but removing the discussion. Now, you might think that's crazy to think they have perfect information. In fact, the whole point of going to doing inspection is you don't have perfect information. But in fact, it's not completely crazy in that there are now things that farms can install, which are continuing emission monitoring systems that can be installed on farms and will provide you continuous readings that could be transmitted to the regulator, and then they could go and when they see that there is a big jump, then they could go and inspect and see whether it's some temporary failure of the machine, or it's something more nasty that is happening. And my co-authors have been working for some time on with the regulator on trying to install continuous emission monitoring systems in various places in India. Another advantage of those CEMS, once you have them, is that you can use them as a basis for trading. You can start having pollution permits and put in place pollution permits trading, which requires good information. But even in the absence of doing that, you can see the potential value of better information and therefore of those type of technologies.